You can start.
Good afternoon. There has been so much in the media about Ruth Bader Ginsburg since her death in September. One wonders if we need more, but maybe some of us think, yes, a little more wouldn't. Today, I'm going to read from a book, Notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. First, just a rundown of a few dates and so on, so we have some chronology. And then I'll read from the book some narratives about her life, law school, Rutgers and Columbia, and of course, Marty, her beloved husband of many years. And then I'll turn to two cases in which she was instrumental. First, just some. Ruth Bader was born in Brooklyn in 1933, went to undergraduate college at Cornell, where she met Marty Ginsburg and married him just a few weeks after her graduation in June 1954. But the Ginsburgs then moved to Oklahoma. Marty had been in the ROTC at college, and the Army was calling him. They went to Fort Sill. There in July 1955, their first child, a daughter, Jane, was born. There they decided that they would like to go into the same profession and decided on law school. When Ruth went in 1955 to Harvard, she was one of 9 women in her class. Marty was a year ahead of her, and he graduated and took a position with a law firm in New York City. So for her 3rd year of law school, Ruth transferred to Columbia Law School for her last year. She made the law review both at Harvard and at Columbia. In 1959, she graduated at the top of her class at Columbia, but she could barely get a job of any sort. Finally, in 1963, she became the 2nd woman to teach full-time at Rutgers University. Rutgers, which is in New Jersey, encouraged her to volunteer for some things, and she volunteered for the New Jersey American Civil Liberties Union. While at Rutgers, she had her 2nd child, James, which she had to disguise her pregnancy in order to keep her job. In 1972, she became the first female tenured professor at Columbia. The same year, she co-founded the Women's Rights Project of the American Civil Liberties. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter nominated her to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. In 1993, President Bill Clinton nominated her to Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, where she served, of course, until her last month. She received her first cancer diagnosis in 1999, and as the media certainly has told us, she battled a number of years. Marty himself died of cancer in 2010. You remember about women on the Supreme Court? Ruth Day O'Connor was the first one, being appointed in 1981 and serving until 2005. Ruth Bader Ginsburg from 1993 to 2020. Sonia Sotomayor was appointed in 2009, and Elena Kagan in 2010, and of course they still. Now to some of the stories. Marty moved through the world with an easy confidence, tempered by an impish sense of humor. One of the Cornell classmates said of Ruth, "Ruth was a wonderful student and a beautiful young woman. Most of the men were in awe of her. Marty was not. He's never been in awe of anybody. Wooed and won her by convincing her how much he respected her. Just because Evelyn, Marty's mother, didn't work outside the home didn't mean Marty expected the same from his future wife. He wanted them to marry and to keep on working together at Harvard. His idea was, Marty later recalled, to be in the same discipline so there would be something you could talk about, bounce ideas off of, know what each other was doing. And we actually sat down and by process of elimination came up with the law. Marty had dropped his chemistry major because it interfered with golf practice. So medical school was out. Harvard Business School did not accept women. So they settled on law. I have thought deep in my heart, Marty would confess 40 years later, that Ruth always intended that to be the case. They both made it into Harvard Law School. Marty, a year older, enrolled immediately, while Kiki stayed in Ithaca to finish at Cornell. In June 1954, they married in the Ginsburg's living room, just days after her graduation from Cornell. He was her childhood. There were 18 people present because in Judaism, that number symbolizes life. Moments before the ceremony, as Ruth made last-minute arrangements, Evelyn, her mother-in-law, asked to come into the bedroom. "Here," said Evelyn, whom Kiki, Ruth, would soon call mother, "I'm going to tell you the secret of a happy marriage. It helps sometimes to be a little deaf." In her outstretched hand were a pair of earplugs. Cambridge would have to wait a little longer for the Ginsburgs. The U.S. Army had other plans for Marty, who had been in the Reserve Officers Training Corps. They were headed to Oklahoma for 2 years to live at Fort Sill base. Marty and RBG were lucky, they realized in retrospect, that soon after marrying, they got sent to the military base in Oklahoma. Spending almost 2 years away from everything they knew, Marty said, allowed the two to learn about each other and to begin to build a life. For the first time in their lives, they had time. Marty quipped of his Army time, "I had a job that, quite literally, required my undivided attention for 4 hours a week. You may as well just share jobs." That didn't necessarily mean splitting everything down the middle, but doing whatever you did a little better or liked a little more or disliked a little less. It turned out there was something Marty did a little better. It all started with tuna casserole, or at least something RBG called tuna casserole. At Fort Sill one night, right after they were married, she dutifully prepared the dish. That was her job, after all, or one of them. Marty squinted at the lumpy mass. "What is it?" And then he taught himself. The Escoffier cookbook had been a wedding gift from RBG's cousin. That legendary French chef, Escoffier, had made his name at hotels like the Ritz in Paris and the Savoy in London. It was not exactly everyday fare for 2 young working parents on a military base in Oklahoma. But Marty found that his chemistry skills came in handy, and he began working his way through the book. Still, for years, the daily cooking was RBG's reluctant territory. Her repertoire involved thawing a frozen vegetable and some meat. "I had 7 things I could make," she said, and when we got to number 7, we went back to number 1. Jane, the daughter, wasn't sure that she'd seen a fresh vegetable until she was sent to France the summer when she turned 14. Around that time, she decided, as RBG put it to me, that mommy should be phased out of the kitchen altogether. RBG cooked her last meal in 1980. By their second year in Cambridge Law School in 1957, RBG had worked out a kind of rhythm. Classes and studying until 4 p.m., then home to relieve the babysitter, a New England grandmotherly type. For hours with Jane, daughter, before bed, helped leaven the library time. Marty was realizing his lifelong passion for the tax code, which he became a very famous tax lawyer. Then the doctor found the tumor in his testicle. Cancer, which had already stolen Ruth's mother, threatened to take Marty too. The doctor prescribed radical surgery and daily radiation for 6 weeks. The prognosis was grim. The last thing Ruth was going to do was to act like Marty was dying. So she threw everything into making sure he stayed on track in his studies, despite having missed all but 2 weeks of the semester. Who were the best note takers in his classes? She handed them carbon paper and told them to pass on the class notes. Each night, she typed those notes up. Marty was weak, but he came alive when his classmates stopped by, and they could argue the finer points of corporate reorganization. Sometimes he woke at midnight, and that was the only time he could eat. Too ill to type, he would lie on the couch and dictate to his wife his paper on lost corporations. When Marty fell asleep around 2 a.m., Ruth would begin her own work. That was how she learned she could get by on just 1 or 2 hours of sleep, as long as she could sleep in a little on the weekends. Now she is at Columbia. Marty is working at a law firm in New York, and she had been just lecturing a little at Columbia. A professor at Columbia, where she had begun lecturing, had heard that Rutgers School of Law was looking for a woman. After all, their only Black professor had just moved on. No one seemed concerned that Columbia's law school had no female or Black full-time faculty. Only 14 women in the entire country had tenure-track positions in law schools, and Rutgers already had one of them. RBG and the fellow Rutgers law professor, Eva Hanks, would soon be profiled in the Newark Star Ledger under the headline, "Robes for Two Ladies." The story led with calling them slim, attractive, and gosh, from their youthful appearance, they could easily be taken. In her first year, Rutgers offered RBG an annual contract to teach. The salary was low. After all, Dean Willard Heckel reminded her, it was a state school, and she was a woman. They told me, we can't pay you as much as A, who has 5 children. You have a husband who earns a good salary. RBG remembered, discreetly withholding specific names. I asked if B, a bachelor, was also paid more. and was told yes. That was the end of the conversation. RBG kept her head down, taking the train each day to Newark from Manhattan's Penn Station and publishing articles with titles like Recognition and Execution of Foreign Civil Judgments and Arbitration Awards. She made it to a second year at Rutgers Law School. In her first classes at Rutgers, there had been maybe 5 or 6 women in every seating. As more men suited up to go to Vietnam, more women filled law school seats. Outside the classroom, Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, chronicling the discontent of educated middle-class women with their domestic roles, had sold over 1 million copies in its first paperback printing. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had almost by accident banned employment discrimination on the basis of sex alongside race, despite many ball and chain jokes from Congress. The New Jersey branch of the American Civil Liberties Union, where RBG had signed up as a volunteer lawyer, was overwhelmed by letters from women. She was a woman, RBG was told, so why couldn't she handle it? She dutifully took them all. A woman who worked at Lipton Tea was barred from adding her family to her health insurance plan because the company assumed only married men had dependents. Girls weren't welcome in Princeton's summer engineering program. The best tennis player in Teaneck, New Jersey wasn't allowed on the varsity team because she was a girl. Some letters gave RBG an embarrassed flush of recognition. Teachers complained that they were forced off the job the moment they started showing pregnancy, and sometimes before. The schools called it maternity leave, but it wasn't voluntary or paid. And the teachers couldn't get their jobs back unless the school felt like it. One military woman had received an honorable discharge for being pregnant, but when she tried to re-enlist, she learned pregnancy was, quote, a moral and administrative disqualification. None of these problems were new. What was new was that anybody thought it worthwhile to complain about it. RBG, in her past life, certainly hadn't. The new crop of female law students, a decade or so younger than her, did more than complain. They made demands. Some of them were fresh from Mississippi, working for civil rights with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. These women had seen lawyers help lead the way, only to come to law school and find that ladies were expected to fall in line. The universities themselves began to grudgingly make more space for women, especially after 1968, when the Johnson administration added sex discrimination to the list of sins that would imperil federal funding. RBG watched these female students with awe. How different they were from her generation, who'd been terrified of making a splash. When a handful of students came to RBG in 1970 and asked her to teach the first ever Rutgers class on women and the law, she was ready to agree. It took her only about a month to read every federal decision and every law review article about women's status. There wasn't much. One popular textbook included the passage, "Land, like woman, was meant to be possessed." The book was about land ownership. Women were just the analogy. When she left the library, RBG knew this much: her days of quiet acceptance were over. That included accepting Rutgers giving her what she called the ladies' discount, that is, lower pay than the male professors. RBG helped the other female professors file a federal action pay discrimination claim against the university, and they won. It is interesting to note as a little footnote that Rutgers, the past few days, is again being sued by a group of tenured women for the vast differentials in pay that they have suffered over. Now I want to turn to a few cases. Here is a little narrative about the first one. This case was called Frontiero v. Richardson. Sharon Frontiero will go on to explain, was a woman in the military who had a dependent husband but was not being awarded the benefits that male in the military had for their wives. Richardson there was the Secretary of the Air Force, the Navy, Secretary of Defense at the time. The same Elliot Richardson of the Saturday Night Massacre, remember. Here is Ruth before the court. RBG had skipped lunch the morning of January 17, 1973. She was afraid she would vomit. Wearing her mother's pin and earrings, like a soldier suiting up for battle, RBG stood alone in front of 9 stone-faced men and asked them to do something that they had until then refused to do. Recognize that the Constitution banned sex discrimination. All oral arguments at the Supreme Court in the same way. Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court. You can listen to the recording of RBG speaking these words. How at first they came out a little shakily. It was her first time arguing before. Distilled the queasiness in her stomach. She had memorized the opening sentence. She told the justices about Sharon Frontiero, an Air Force lieutenant whose husband, Joseph, had been denied the same housing, medical, and dental benefits as other military spouses, simply because Sharon was a woman and Joseph was a man. 14 months earlier, the court had ruled on the case of an Idaho woman who had been denied the right to administer her dead son's estate because she was a woman. The justices said in that case, Reed v. Reed, that the state couldn't automatically assume men were better equipped to handle an estate than women. But they had left unsettled the broader question of whether discriminating on the basis of sex was almost always unconstitutional. RBG took a deep breath and told the justices that they had to finish the job that they had started. The state law, which was what was applied in Reed v. Reed, and the federal one she challenged that day in Frontiero v. Richardson, RBG argued, drew on the same stereotype, namely, that the man is or should be the independent partner in a marital unit. The woman, with an occasional exception, is dependent, sheltered from breadwinning experience. Suddenly, she felt the ground begin to steady under her. These men, the most important judges in the country, were her captive audience for the next 10 minutes. RBG knew so much more about the case, the topic, than they did. She had to teach them. She knew how to do that. RBG had been teaching the law for almost a decade. Mrs. Ruth Ginsburg read the Supreme Court bar admissions card she had been handed in the court that day to enter. RBG had gone by Ms. MS since there had been an MS, Ms. The students in her Columbia seminar who had come along that day to see her grimaced and wanted her to demand a change. She would not. RBG was there to win, not to rock the boat when it wasn't strictly necessary. Her argument was radical enough. These distinguished men of the court thought of themselves as good fathers and good husbands. Men and women were fundamentally different, they believed, and women were lucky to be spared the squalor and the pressures of the real world. This little woman, she was very tiny, this little woman, not yet 40 years old, had to make the justices see that women deserved the same standing in the world. Treating men and women differently under the law, RBG told the justices, implied a judgment of inferiority. It told women that their work and their families were less valuable than those of men. These distinctions have a common effect, RBG said sternly. They help keep woman in her place, a place inferior to that occupied by men in our society. Her opponent that day was the federal government in charge of the military. In a brief, the government defended its policy of assuming women were dependents and allowing only a narrow pool of men to apply for dependent benefits. After all, most breadwinners were men. On the first page of that brief was the name of Erwin Griswold, RBG's old Harvard law dean, now the nation's Solicitor General. She'd come a long way from telling Dean Griswold when she first entered Harvard Law School in a fit of nervousness, that she'd gone to law school to make better wifely chit-chat with Marty. The justices still hadn't said a word. RBG continued. Sex, like race, is a visible, immutable characteristic bearing no necessary relationship to ability. The analogy had special meaning in the constitutional context. In a series of cases triggered by the famous decision, Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, integration of schools, the court had said that laws that classified on the basis of race were almost always unconstitutional or deserving strict scrutiny. The court had said in the Ree v. Reed case, this was the woman who wanted to administer her dead son's estate and had been denied by the state of Idaho because she was in that case. The court had said in Reed that it wasn't applying strict scrutiny, but then it seemed to do so anyway. Were laws that classified what men and women could do blatantly unconstitutional, the way the laws classifying by race were. RBG boldly urged the court to say that they were. Her time was almost up. RBG looked at the justices in the eye and quoted Sarah Grimke, the abolitionist and advocate for women's. She spoke not eloquently, but with unmistakable authority. She said, quoting Sarah Grimke, "I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our." Lawyers arguing at the Supreme Court sometimes have trouble getting out even a full sentence before they are interrupted by the justices with their questions. That January day, on an empty stomach and with Brooklyn vowels still in her voice, RBG spoke for 10 minutes without a single interruption from the justices. She had stunned them into silence. Underneath her composure, RBG was trembling. Were the justices even listening? She would have to wait 5 months to find out when the decision came. As the crowd filed out after the argument, a stocky figure approached RBG. It was Dean Griswold of Harvard Law School. Now, an important attorney general, in fact. He had been watching one of his own men argue against RBG and the other lawyer who had represented Frontiero in her case. Solemnly, Griswold shook RBG's hand. That night, Justice Harry Blackmun, who in his diary graded lawyers on their performance before the court, gave RBG only a C+. Very precise. On May 14, 1973, the Supreme Court ruled on Frontiero v. Richardson. First case, RBG had argued before the court herself. Technically, she won again. The justices struck down the rule that treated Sharon Frontiero's work as less important to her family than a male service member's would be to his. Justice William Brennan's opinion, sounded like a win, he said. Traditionally, such discrimination was rationalized by an attitude of romantic paternalism, which in practical effect, women not on a pedestal, but in a cage. Taking the words right out of feminist lawyers' mouths. But there weren't 5 votes for the broader rule that would make most classifications unconstitutional. Not enough for RBG learned a lesson that would stay with her for the rest of her life. She had been trying to teach the justices, and she wouldn't give up. But as she later acknowledged, one doesn't learn a lesson in one day. Generally, change in our society is incremental. Real change, enduring change, happens one step at a time. She would have to be patient. She would have to be strategic, and maybe a little deaf. That was Frontiero. Now, after the next very famous, or some like infamous case, Shelby County versus Holder. Eric Holder. and Shelby County in Alabama. This case has to do with whether states and locations in the country that have very bad records on voting rights, whether they should have to kind of pre-clearance if they wanted to change any of their voting laws, pre-clearance from. And the Voting Rights Act of 1985, that provision had been in the states and localities that had these records would have to, if they wanted to make any changes in voting regulations, get it cleared with. So in 1906, or 2006, Republicans and Democrats had come together to declare that even more than 40 years after its passage, the Voting Rights Act was still necessary to protect minorities from disenfranchisement. A reauthorization of that 1965 legislation, Voting Rights Act, was unanimously approved in the Senate. Imagine, unanimously approved in the Senate. And the vote in the House was 390 to 33. This was to continue the pre-clearance measure. And it was signed into law by George W. Bush. However, this consensus hid a hot, bubbling conservative rebellion. Decades earlier, a young Reagan administration lawyer named John Roberts authored a memo arguing that the law should be written such that incidents of voter suppression would, quote, not be too easy to prove, as they provide a basis for the most intrusive interference imaginable, end quote. Apparently, it was harder for Roberts to imagine the intrusiveness of being blocked from voting. It was finally the decision came down on June 25th, 2013. Chief Justice John Roberts' turn to announce an opinion he had assigned. The case was Shelby County v. Holder, challenge to the constitutionality of a major portion of the Voting Rights Act. Roberts had an amiable Midwestern affect and a knack for simple but eloquent phrases that served him well when he was a lawyer arguing before the justices. Any racial discrimination in voting is too much, Roberts declared that morning. But our country has changed in the last 50 years. One of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation of the 20th century, that is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, had been born of violent images, the faces of murdered civil rights activists in Philadelphia, Mississippi, Alabama state troopers shattering the skull of young John Lewis on a bridge in Selma. But for this new challenge to voting rights came from 60 miles away from Selma, Roberts had a more comforting picture to offer the country. High Black voter turnout had elected Barack Obama. There were Black mayors in Alabama and Mississippi. The protections Congress had authorized only a few years earlier were no longer justifiable. Racism was pretty much over now, and everyone could move on. RBG waited quietly for her turn to speak. Announcing a majority opinion in the court chamber is custom, But reading aloud a dissent is rare. It's like pulling the fire alarm, a public shaming of the majority that you want the world to hear. RBG's voice had grown both raspier and fainter, but that morning there was no missing her passion. The noble purpose of the Voting Rights Act, she said, was to fight voter suppression that lingered, if more subtly. The court's conservative justices were supposed to care about restraint and defer to Congress, but they had wildly overstepped. Hubris is a word for today's demolition of the Voting Rights Act, RBG had written in her dissenting. Killing the Voting Rights Act because it had worked well, she had added, was like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you were not getting wet. The stake, RBG told the courtroom, was that what was once the subject of a dream, the equal citizenship stature of all in our polity, voice to every voter in our democracy, undiluted by race. It was an obvious reference to Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, but the phrase equal citizenship stature had special meaning to RBG in particular. 40 years earlier, RBG had stood before a different set of justices and forced them to see that women were people too in the eyes of the Constitution. That women, along with men, deserved equal citizenship stature, to stand with all the rights and responsibilities that being a citizen meant. As part of a movement inspired by Martin Luther King's, RBG had gone from having doors slammed in her face to winning 5 out of 6 of the women's rights cases she had argued before the Supreme Court. No one, not the firms and judges that had refused to hire a young mother, not the bosses who had forced her out of a job for getting pregnant or paid her less for being a woman. None of these had ever expected her to be sitting up there at the court. RBG often repeated her mother's advice that getting angry was a waste of your own time. Even more, she shared her mother-in-law's counsel for marriage, that sometimes it helped to be a little deaf. The words had served her in the bad old days of blatant sexism, although the conservative backlash of the 80s and on a court of people essentially stuck together for life. But lately, RBG was tired of pretending not to hear. Roberts had arrived on the court full of promises of compromise, but a few short years and a handful of 5-4 decisions were swiftly threatening the progress for which so far. That 2012-2013 term, reading dissent from the bench in 5 cases, RBG broke a half-century-long record among all justices. Her dissent in the voting rights case was the last and most furious. At nearly 10:30 a.m., RBG quoted Martin Luther King directly. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And then she added her own words, if there is steadfast commitment to see it asked through to completion. Not exactly poetry, but pure RBG. On or off the bench, she had always been steadfast, and when the work is justice, she has every intention to see it to the end. RBG had always been about doing the work. People wondered where the quiet and seemingly meek RBG had gone, where this firebrand had come from. But the truth is, that woman had always been there. Authors of the book have a concluding paragraph about this case. The conservatives had fought the big line about the tyranny of unelected justices, but in Shelby County v. Holden, the justices overrode elected officials, that is, senators and representativism to strike down a major portion of a law that helped people get access to the ballot. Ruth Bader Ginsburg told the New York Times, "The court has the reputation of being conservative, but if you take activism to mean readiness to strike down laws passed by Congress, I think the current court will go down in history as one of the most active courts in that regard." Her grim predictions have come true, authors of this. In the years since Shelby, states have jumped to make it harder to vote, and a passage of laws whose impact falls disproportionately on people of color and the poor. We put down the umbrella because we weren't getting wet, RBG said, but the storm is raging. Thank you. And I do wish we were sitting in front of each other so we could have a lively conversation, but alas, we can't.